Zen and the Art of Solar PV Maintenance. I promised myself I wouldn't write anything in this piece that was specifically about COVID-19. There's been too much interesting stuff written already. However, I've realised that reflecting on the last 8 to 10 weeks of lockdown is a useful foundation for me to start this article, especially given its focus on how quality feeds into the next stage of society's low-carbon story. For my family and me, the period of lockdown has allowed us to focus on the qualitative aspects of our lives. This includes, but it's not limited to, the connections between each of us, accentuated by us all being forced into the same spaces and activities, as opposed to our sort of more individualised ways of being beforehand. So a greater awareness also of the beauty that comes with fewer cars, birdsong, the quiet in between the noise, using our legs more and finding new places locally, and so on. This emergence of a greater awareness of the beauty in the things we cannot quantify is a meditation, I've realised, on quality. It's a word that has really had little significance in the majority of our lives, economies and interactions over the last few decades as a globalised economy has emerged and the focus of its momentum has been on quantity and more quantity. This has been at the expense of quality and, as many columnists have pointed out, is possibly one of the root causes for the ensuing environmental degradation, lack of biodiversity and the emergent pathways for viruses to connect with humans. And it's this environmental crisis that we need to bring to the forefront of our actions now. As Mark Carney so eloquently put it, we can't self-isolate from the climate crisis. So if this COVID-19 induced lockdown will lead enlightened political leaders to take the necessary actions and preemptively act as the science has been telling us to by decarbonising, rewilding and reducing our voracious consumption of the Earth's finite natural resources, how can we ensure that this pathway, if taken, also does not make the same mistake of following a quantitative pathway that ignores quality? The key reason I reminded myself of this was when I recently reread Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, who originally wrote the book in the 1970s. It tells the story of the author on a motorcycle trip with his son and friends across America and his reflections on the psychological breakdown of a part of him that he refers to as Phaedrus as he tackles the question of quality from a philosophical perspective. His musings relate to his experience of everyday life as he sees his friends and others live their lives with little or no interest in how things work. And for the author, his specific focus is his motorbike. In essence, the key message that I took away from the book, which I would recommend everyone to read, is that we are able to better understand the quality of things when we understand the systems that comprise them and are able, therefore, to respond to problems with a greater understanding, awareness and capacity. It's this systems approach and primary focus on quality that's really been ruminating in my brain for some time now before falling out on the page before me via my pen. Again, something for which I've almost forgotten the qualitative benefits of after doing so much work on a computer. I think it's right to say that renewable generation investment up until now, to the large part, has been driven by quantity. Reflecting on the typical investment process, there are a number of factors at play which what I really want to try and disaggregate and examine here. First is the life cycle of investors in renewable energy. So typically, most larger scale investments are undertaken by developers who may have no long-term interest in the viability of the generation asset. I should say here that there are certainly developers that we know who do take a long-term interest, but my worry is that they're in the minority. In brief, these short-term investors find the capital to develop and then employ an engineering, procurement and construction, or EPC business, to build and manage the asset so it meets a minimum energy generation hurdle, which is basically a specified minimum amount of energy for at least the next 2 years. This is so that they can sell it on at a profit to another investor with the data, the generation data, to back up its efficacy. That story then repeats itself again and again until typically the asset ends up with a long-term investor, such as a pension fund, who will hold it until the end of its life, say 20 to 25 years. One problem with this is that every transaction is based on a quantitative measure, profit, the sale price less the cost to develop and maintain, and on an assumed level of quality, which is that the system keeps producing specified energy levels. And it's this qualitative assumption that the system will keep producing a set amount of energy that is put most at risk by this investment sort of house of cards. It assumes that the initial investor-developer built their system with the long-term quality of the system at its core. Yet this is not and will not be the case when the investment horizon for that investor is a few years. As long as the developer's EPC can keep that asset producing enough energy for the initial period, the system will get sold and then sold again until eventually it ends up in somebody's pension fund. This existing system does not bode well for any country that's looking to significantly transform its energy system to low or zero carbon, as it has short-termism as its main driver, which sits in direct opposition to what we need, a long-term sustainable system with quality at its foundation. We at Argand and many others in the sector are seeing the impacts of this as sites that were built in the solar coaster years of the feed-in tariff in the UK and elsewhere start to fail. Many were built with cheap, imported, relatively unskilled labour, the consequences of a profit, short-term and quantity-driven system, and are now experiencing significant electrical issues that lead to significant reductions in energy output. We need to remember that everything we do relies on energy, and specifically electricity. Even the internet requires electricity to run. Electricity is so important to our society that we cannot allow the vagaries of a quantity-driven market to dictate this shift to a low or zero carbon future. We need to realign quality at the heart of this transition. This focus on quality reminds me of sort of rights and responsibilities. Our society almost always talks about their rights, but very rarely discusses the responsibilities required to ensure that those rights are maintained. And again, this investment process is similar to the building industry, where the 3 Bs dominate of buy, build and bugger off. Buy the land, build the property, and then go off to a new project with their profits intact. As the property development system does not necessarily align the interests of the property developers with those of the people who buy and rent them, we're starting to see a housing stock that evidently starts to fail within years as opposed to lasting for decades, if not 100 years plus, which is what we need. In the building industry, there have been voices pushing for new models to realign interests, whereby developers get a smaller return at the start and have a long-term interest in the yield from the properties, which ensures that they build them with a high level of quality at the start so they keep higher rents longer into the future. In my opinion, we need to approach low carbon generation with the same lens, whereby all investors need to be aligned with the long-term viability of the assets that they build. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any underlying system that is driving the requirement for quality as it is today. What we need is a conversation about how to align the long-term interests of our energy system with those who we trust to develop it. If we do decide to undertake a new Green Deal, as some political parties are proposing, mobilising trillions to decarbonise our economy, we would do well to contemplate quality first before we set off on a path to a low-carbon infrastructure that starts to potentially fail 5 to 10 years in. And that would be the worst of all outcomes.